secret arranged. We should wait
want to welcome you to the first major event that the Solomon Center is sponsoring this spring, and I want to thank you for being the exact right number of people to fill this room. So impressed, and thank you for coming out in the perfect number. A lot of you, I think, are here because you got an email from us or you checked our website. If you want to make sure you get news about future events, and if you don't think you're on our email list, just drop a note off to me or to Sandra Rodriguez or Sandra somewhere working around. Just give me a note that has your name and your address, and we'll make sure to put you on the email list. I want to give some special thanks before we get started. The special thanks to Michael and Sonia Saltman, who are here in the front row, the founders of the Saltman Center for Conflict Resolution. There's a lot of other folks that I'd like to thank as well, some of whom are here, not all of whom are here. I'd like to thank our Dean, John Valerie White, who's a great supporter of the program. We have a lot of the law school professors here. We have a lot of the members of our Saltman Center Board of Advisors here. We have our former Dean, Dick Morgan, who, together with the Saltmans, founded the Saltman Center. So we have many, many people here. He's back there in the back, who I'd like to thank. Let me tell you just a tiny bit about the Saltman Center before we get started for today's event, because some of you are very familiar with us, and others perhaps don't know that much about what the Saltman Center does. We're basically a center that studies conflict resolution. We figured that out from the name. We teach courses on conflict resolution. Some of those courses are only for our law students, but we also offer courses for folks who are not law students. And this summer, for example, we're going to have 4 courses that are available to folks from the community who are interested in learning more about various aspects of conflict resolution. We have what we call our Summer Institute, and we don't have it all on the website yet, but soon we're going to have information about that on the website. We have a series of public lectures and public conferences. The next one after this is going to be on April the 8th. It's going to be a film, Burma BJ, which was an Oscar-nominated film, which is really quite timely. It's about the revolution that took place in Burma a number of years ago, attempting to put down the dictators that were in power in Burma at the time. It didn't quite work, but the film is very interesting about not only the attempted revolution there, but also folks who were filming that revolution and how that had an impact. And I think you'll see it's very timely for the kinds of events that are going on in the Middle East today. In addition to teaching, of course, we do scholarship about conflict resolution. As well, we do actual attempts to resolve conflict. So we have a mediation clinic that works closely with the family court, for example, and helps to resolve conflict. We have a project going on in the Middle East. So we did quite a few things, and we'd love to have you be part of our events. Bob Mnookin has been a speaker here before. About 5 years ago, Bob Mnookin gave a fantastic talk about conflict resolution in the Middle East. He's a member of our Board of Advisors. We think that's probably his greatest claim to fame, but others might say that he has other great claims to fame. He's a professor at Harvard Law School, a chair professor at Harvard Law School. He directs, actually he's the, what is the exact title? He's the chair of the Harvard Program on Negotiation. He directs the Harvard Negotiation Project. He's written, I think, 8 books. He went to Harvard Law School. He went to Harvard undergrad. He clerked for the U.S. Supreme Court. He's done lots of great things. For our purposes, one of the most important things is that he's a really great speaker. I've heard him speak a number of times. He's very articulate, very clear. I know you'll enjoy hearing from him. But the reason that we invited him to speak tonight is that he's one of the most insightful speakers and thinkers in the world of conflict resolution. Now, once in a while, I think that I have myself a good idea about conflict resolution, and almost every time I've thought I've had a good idea, it turns out that Bob Mnookin has had that idea, and more so, and have written about it and turned it into a book before I ever got there. Some of you who've taken conflict resolution courses, or even a civil procedure course, have heard the phrase, bargaining in the shadow of the law. This is the guy who invented the phrase. So he's done that in many, many areas of conflict resolution. Tonight he's going to speak about this book that you see up on the slide. Oh, actually not anymore, I guess, but his book is Bargaining with the Devil. Let's see, Negotiating with the Devil. Anyway, what the book addresses is whether one ought to negotiate with certain groups or certain people. And it's a really interesting subject from the perspective of folks like me who study conflict resolution, because many in our field always assume, well, of course, negotiation is a great thing, and it's almost anathema to even think that maybe you shouldn't negotiate. But this is a great example of where Professor Mnookin takes on a subject that's a really important subject, because I remember him bringing this topic up to me a few years back and saying, what I'm thinking about is when you should not negotiate. And it took me a few minutes to even catch on to what he was talking about, but he explained it, and I did. And what he's talking about is, there are going to be situations where it doesn't make sense to negotiate, because you're negotiating potentially against someone where you're just not going to get anywhere. But what he's done in this book and what he's going to do in this talk is give us a framework and analysis for how to think about when you should negotiate, because it might make sense and you might get to some good results, and when, on the other hand, it doesn't make sense because the person or the group against whom you're negotiating are just not the kinds of folks against whom you want to have a negotiation. So his book that he's going to talk about uses examples from history, such as negotiating with Hitler, but we can think about examples from today that make this talk so timely. So, you could think about negotiating with the pirates, or you could think about negotiating with the folks in Libya, or negotiating with the folks in Egypt. And, are these the kinds of people that it makes sense to negotiate with, or do you have to use a different approach? I'm not going to waste any more of the time. I'm going to let Bob take over. He's going to speak for a while. Then we're going to have a question and answer period. And then we still have a little bit of coffee and cookies outside, I think, so that we can then mingle after the event is over. So thanks again, and let's join Bob for the talk.
Gene, thank you for that too generous introduction. You left out the most important thing. I'm from Kansas City, Missouri. And in fact, that's where I came from today, because you can go home again. And I spoke at the Kansas City, Missouri Public Library at an event, and it was fantastic. It was great fun. It's wonderful to be back here in Las Vegas. And, I think what Gene has done here at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, with the support of Eugene, together with Consultants Help, is just terrific. So I was delighted when you invited me to come talk. This book, Bargaining with the Devil, When to Negotiate, When to Fight, really addresses the following question. Should you bargain with the devil? Now, I probably ought to define a few terms. And first is, what do I mean by bargain? By bargain, I mean try to resolve a conflict through negotiation rather than resisting and fighting it out. More importantly, what do I mean by devil? I don't believe in the devil literally. But by devil, I mean someone with whom you're in conflict, where you don't trust them, where they've hurt you in the past, or you think that they're likely to hurt you in the future. Someone or regime you may even think is evil. Now, I have to confess that in my zip code, 02138 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the word evil is avoided like the plague. It's said to have religious overtones. It's not politically correct. In fact, though, in the book, after thinking about it for a while, I concluded that, in my view, there are evil acts. Indeed, it occurred to me, how could anyone who lived through any part of the last century and not think that they're evil acts? And I define evil in the book, an evil act, as the intentional infliction of grievous harm on some other human being without an adequate justification. Now, people can, of course, say, oh, there are weasel words there. How much harm is grievous? Can't there be arguments about what's adequate justification? To which my response is, of course there can be arguments. But I guess I'm not enough of a cultural relativist to think that, in fact, we haven't seen regimes that have systematically inflicted grievous harm on all kinds of people because of their gender, their religion, their race. And I don't have any difficulty characterizing such regimes as evil. Nor do I have any difficulty characterizing some acts that human beings engage in as evil. Okay. Against that backdrop, I guess what the book's about is how do you think about whether you should negotiate with someone who you at least perceive to be a devil in this sense. And I want to say at the outset that there's much more demonization in the world than there are devils in the world. But what I wanted to write a book about is the most difficult kinds of conflicts, where the adversaries really mistrust each other and often have very strong emotions towards each other. Well, should you bargain with the devil? This question, what intrigued me about the question, and Gene suggested as much in the introduction, is our national leaders face this kind of question of when you should negotiate and when you shouldn't, all the time. I mean, think about North Korea. To what extent should we be engaging North Korea? Iran and the nuclear weapons. Libya today. Pirates. There are all kinds of examples where, in fact, in terms of statecraft, you're confronted with a leader or a regime that you distrust, which you think may well, in the pursuit of their own interests, be willing to hurt your interests, and whom you may even think are evil. What should you do? Now, what struck me about the question, though, is my experience as a professional is primarily as a mediator. I mediated a number of complex commercial disputes, typically between big companies, where there is often hundreds of millions of dollars at stake, sometimes even more. And you'd think, oh, well, that's just all rational actor stuff. It's about maximizing expected returns, the rational assessment of risks. In my experience, that's not true, often. Often, in fact, in business conflicts, there's a lot of demonization going on. In fact, I've mediated a number of failed joint ventures. Failed joint ventures are like often very nasty divorces. Executives feel betrayed by one another. They feel they've been taken advantage of. Often one is quite prepared to renegotiate the deal. And one of them says, renegotiate the deal? You broke your word on the old deal. I just want to clobber you in court. All right? Other business disputes that I've been involved in are between competitors, where one competitor thinks another competitor has stolen its intellectual property. It may have invested hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions, even more in creating that intellectual property. There are software developers and others within the organization who've spent thousands of hours developing something. They see some competitor rip it off, and let me tell you, they want blood. They're furious. Sometimes the party on the other side says, let's negotiate a license. Negotiate a license? I'd like to see you put in jail. You're a thief. Right? So it comes up in business. Sadly, the question comes up in family conflicts. Now, it's no surprise that there are some divorces, of course, where there's a lot of demonization and a huge amount of hostility. There's a fight over money or custody. What's also true is, and in fact, I'll survey the audience. I've been doing this lots of different places. Consider your own family. Consider your cousins, your parents, your grandparents, their siblings. Let's spread it out a little bit. Has there been a dispute within your family over family property over which family members stopped speaking? Now, if I asked you to raise your hand, I'd have to raise mine. there certainly has been. How many here are willing to acknowledge that in their case, see, oh, God, Las Vegas people are more honest than most places. Most places it's about 40%. I think the real number is maybe higher. But, in fact, the fight may be over a portrait of Grandpa. The fight may be over Mom's engagement ring and who's going to get it. Sometimes the fight's over a family business. Sometimes the fight's over a family home or a vacation home. But these conflicts over family property can lead to terrible breaches in relationships that have long-lasting effects. So what intrigued me about this book, and Simon & Schuster was kind enough to publish it, notwithstanding the following problem. I was asked, I wrote exactly the book I wrote the proposal for. I wanted to really write it where I told stories about each of these three domains. But someone asked me, the key question, by the way, if you write a book, trade book, what section of the bookstore does it go in? And I didn't have an easy answer. But nonetheless, it's the book I wanted to write. Now, the question I pose is, should you bargain with the devil? And as I've described to you, I think it's a question that really cuts across a pretty broad domain. You hear answers that are categorical. Okay? One categorical answer, Gene referred, and it's the one associated with our field. And that is, you should always be prepared to negotiate. To negotiate does not mean you're going to give up what's most important to you. It means that you're going to be prepared to sit down and listen and learn and explore whether in some problem-solving way you can resolve a conflict. Surely it's better to resolve a conflict through negotiation than through fighting it out in court that can take months or years and cost thousands, tens of thousands, millions of dollars. Moreover, in terms of international diplomacy, of course, is better than fighting things out with arms. So in our field, many of us come very close to categorically asserting you should always be prepared to negotiate. Now, although there isn't so much talk of this, once again, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, there is a categorical answer quite the other way. And the categorical answer the other way, of course, relates to the Faustian legend. You all know the Faustian legend. The implication of the Faustian legend is you should never bargain with the devil. The devil's probably smarter than you are. The devil is probably going to tempt you by offering you something you really think you want. But you bargain with the devil, and you risk soiling your soul. You risk, apart from the religious notion, you risk behaving in a way, by doing business with an evildoer, behaving in a way where, in fact, it should be inconsistent with the values that you hold most dear. All right? So there are these two categorical answers. Now, none is surprising. In fact, most of us probably realize, in some ways, slightly rhetorical, because most of us probably wouldn't be quite as categorical as either of these answers. But the reason I want to identify them is because they, in fact, are both ideas that are out there that have some ideological sway. Now, I'm going to ask you the following question. I want you to think about who are your two greatest political heroes of the 20th century? And why? Here are mine.
Yeah.
Winston Churchill and Nelson Mandela. And I have a chapter of the book about each of them. Winston Churchill is my hero because in May of 1940, shortly after he'd become Prime Minister, at what was really Great Britain's very darkest hour, he refused to negotiate. Now, although you won't learn anything of this in reading his magisterial 5-volume history of World War II, in fact, in May of 1940, this was only a matter of weeks after he had become Prime Minister, Lord Halifax, who was the foreign minister, and the Italian ambassador to Great Britain, cooked up a scheme where Mussolini was going to mediate an end to the war between Great Britain and Nazi Germany. And for several days in the War Cabinet, there was a debate about what to do. Now, the minutes of those War Cabinet debates really only became available roughly a decade ago. And they're extraordinarily interesting to read. And to cut to the chase, what Churchill did was he refused to contemplate any kind of exploration of negotiation with Hitler. It was, in fact, I think, a very tough decision. At that time, the United States was not in the war. Indeed, our ambassador to Great Britain was Joseph Kennedy. President Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, to say he was a defeatist in terms of Great Britain's chances is an understatement. Kennedy was sending cables back to Roosevelt saying, the British are cooked, France is about to fall. They did fall very shortly after this period. The British are going to suffer a humiliating defeat. They had 150,000 troops on the continent, the British Expeditionary Force. And Roosevelt went so far as to suggest to Great Britain that perhaps they should send a fleet to Canada so that after Great Britain was overrun, at least the fleet would be available for use, perhaps, from sailors from the Commonwealth, who knows. The Soviet Union, by the way, was not in the war. Hitler and Stalin had signed what was, without question, the most cynical agreement of all times, where they agreed to carve up Poland, and they both suspected they'd probably soon be at war with each other, but they each thought they'd benefit more from delay. But in all events, France was falling, it was hopeless, and this was before Dunkirk. So it was a pretty dark hour, to say the least. How about Mandela? Mandela was my hero because he chose to negotiate. After Mandela had been in prison, he had a life sentence for treason. He was in prison, had served more than 20 years. He alone decided secretly to reach out to suggest talks to a man named Coetzee, who was the Minister of Justice in South Africa. Mandela had devoted his adult life to the African National Congress. He was the most famous leader of the African National Congress, but he was not the head of the ANC. The head of the ANC was Oliver Tambo. He was in exile. And actually, he and Mandela were able to communicate secretly. Their lawyers would sneak in messages, but it was some time consuming. Mandela's lawyer would sneak stuff in. The ANC had a policy with respect to negotiating with the National Party. The National Party is the party that had erected the apartheid regime. It was an evil regime, let me assure you. The ANC's stated policy, it was exactly the policy you often hear when someone wants to say that they're willing to negotiate, but they're really not. They had a few preconditions. This was a little bit like President Bush's willingness to negotiate with Iran. The preconditions the ANC had were they would enter into negotiations after the National Party freed all political prisoners, unbanned both the Communist Party and the African National Congress, and abolished apartheid. They would then enter into negotiations with them in terms of what kind of democracy there would be. In other words, Michael, I'll negotiate with you, but the precondition is you first have to concede in advance most of the things we'd be talking about in the negotiation. They were taking a very hard line. Mandela's memoir, which I commend to you, he asked himself a question. can I really do this without consulting with my colleagues? Can I write to Coetzee and suggest secret talk should begin? And now, getting a hold of Otto Tessel is hard, but on the other hand, he had in the same prison 3 or 4 senior colleagues from the African National Congress that he got to see all the time. And he asked himself, should I consult him? And then he answered his own question. He says, I'm not going to ask them. And his book is very explicit. Why won't I ask them? Because I know what their answer would be. We must know. So here was a great leader who chose to negotiate. Now, both of these stories, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, I mean, I'm sure you get 2 great examples. But on the other hand, what I think is really interesting, what the book tries to do, and it does this through stories, is to analyze, not by looking back, because it's too easy after the fact to judge by the outcome whether the decision to negotiate or not was wise, but instead analyze what the thinking process was of people engaged in intense conflicts when they're trying to decide whether to negotiate or not. Now, the challenge in all events, I claim, is to make wise decisions. There aren't going to be categorical answers. And indeed, it's going to be highly contextual. The wise decision is going to depend on what the facts and circumstances are at a particular time. And the hard issue is, well, how do you think about this issue, of whether you should or not? Luckily, let me put it aside, why is it hard? The reason thinking clearly about whether to negotiate is hard is, first of all, when there's something you perceive as devilish on the other side, or a demon out to hurt you, that provokes very strong emotions, namely fear and anger. Right? It's hard to think straight when there's strong emotions like this. But there are also a second set of problems that are extremely difficult, and that is, it poses a lot of moral quandaries. For example, let's take a contemporary issue. In terms of Libya, right? The Gaddafis. Should we try to negotiate a deal where they get $1 billion? They probably have much more than that in various bank accounts. And they go into a quiet exile. How many of you would be willing to make that deal? How many lives might be saved if you could get him to go quietly? Right? On the other hand, to reward this tyrant by buying him off, that makes you feel a little queasy. And that's just, I just toss that out to suggest that there are troubling questions about that really pose issues relating to kind of the limits of utilitarian and consequentialist thinking that are really posed by all this. Well, luckily, partially helped. I introduced in the book someone who's probably familiar to many of you. This is not Dr. Spock, it's Mr. Spock. And Mr. Spock is a Vulcan. And the good thing about Mr. Spock is he has great emotional detachment. In fact, he's kind of a cold fish. But he doesn't let emotions cloud his thinking very much. And what Mr. Spock, in the book, I identify a lot of traps. I'm not going to take time tonight to go through them. But Mr. Spock is not prone to these traps. But these are the kinds of traps when there's, in these kinds of most intense conflicts, often make clear thinking very difficult. There's one of these that is a little bit jargonish. That's the zero-sum trap. The zero-sum trap is the idea that the negotiation with Kerry wins, I lose. When I win, Kerry loses. If you add together the outcomes, it's a zero. It means that a negotiation is purely distributed. And one of the things that Carrie and I and all of us in our field do all the time is urge people to turn down the volume of what I call the zero-sum gremlin. And that is the impulse to view a negotiation as purely distributed. We, in fact, are very committed to the idea that there are often opportunities to expand the pie and create value. Spock is not part of that problem. Now, Mr. Spock, in the book, I identify an approach that is probably somewhat familiar to, and the questions ought to be familiar to people that have really thought about negotiation and who think about preparing for negotiation. These are questions that Mr. Spock has you ask in deciding whether to negotiate or not. And essentially what he wants to know is, first of all, what are your interests? What are the range of things that are important to you going forward? People often in conflict have not thought through carefully their own interests. What's even more typical is they haven't given any thought, or serious thought, to what the interest of the other side is. And what Spock will insist on is thinking through, what are the other side's interests too? Spock's going to then want to know, if you don't negotiate, what are your alternatives? I mean, for example, if the issue is whether to negotiate with a particular car dealer to try to buy a car or not, you might decide you're not going to bother because you have a very good alternative. Someone else has already offered to sell you a car, even below cost. How good your alternative is can affect whether it makes sense to negotiate. And so Spock is going to want you to think through carefully what your alternatives are. And part of the preparation for any negotiation is to think about, how can I improve my alternatives away from the table? You've also got to think about what are the alternatives for the other side. What you're doing here is trying to lay the foundation so you can think about, are there potential negotiated outcomes that could make this person better off and make us better off too? Right? I mean, for example, with Iran, it is easy to imagine. Iran has a lot of interests. The United States has a lot of interests. It's easy to imagine a grand bargain in which Iran gives up the pursuit of nuclear weapons, stops supporting Hamas and Hezbollah, in exchange for a deal where we pledge and act on the pledge that we're not going to try to upset that regime at all. And that we're also going to engage in full and open trade so that economically Iran could benefit a whole lot economically. Now that's a potential negotiated outcome. It certainly would make the United States better off. It would also probably make the Iranian people better off, except for those who wanted regime change, because part of the deal would be we no longer will be pressing for regime change. But what you want to think about in terms of should I negotiate is, are there potential negotiated outcomes that might serve both sides' interests better than their alternatives? You've also got to worry about issues of implementation, because it is the devil on the other side. Can you verify that they're living up to their commitments? I mean, with North Korea, that was a big problem. In the Clinton administration, we did make a deal with North Korea. It turns out they were violated. All right? And you've got to worry. It's not enough to even imagine that you could, but you've also got to worry about, if we do make this deal, can it be enforced? And finally, what are the costs? Costs in terms of precedent, whatever. Anyway, there are these various questions. There are also these questions of legitimacy, morality, identity, and self-respect. I want to come back to those. But let me simply say, these are not trivial. And although Spock is very much a utilitarian, and I mean, for example, in one example of his book, a betrayed joint venture partner, Spock explains to him why, in fact, it would make more sense in terms of this company's interests to negotiate a resolution with a larger company that had betrayed them. And the executive of the company said to Spock, I can't do it. And Spock asked, what are you worried about? Your reputation? We've taken that into account. That's beyond the way of commercial reputation with others. And the executive said, no, I'm worried about my reputation with myself. I cannot live with myself if I end up, because this person, what they've done, renegotiating the deal, even if in fact I'm better off than I would be if I pursued litigation. Hard times. What Spock did remind this executive of was that he was not the company. They had a board of directors, there were a lot of shareholders, there were employees. And Spock sort of asked, on the basis of your own moral intuitions, if in fact the company's better off, do you really think you should be deciding on this basis? Anyway, the book involves 9 stories. It's the first book I've written that my wife, who's an extraordinarily bright woman, actually has read. Because this book is written for, I actually, in my own head, it was written for what I sort of think of as the NPR audience. You know, people, intelligent people who are interested in issues, but not just for my colleagues who in the dispute resolution field, or lawyers or mediators are concerned with dispute resolution. I've been pleased that they too are reading it, and they've enjoyed it, but I really want it very much. It's the kind of book you should only write after you have tenure. I very much wanted to try to communicate with the broader audience. Let me just describe very briefly, and then I want to take some questions, what some of the stories are. I'm not going to go into any details. 2 of them involve stories of individuals who confronted evil regimes and had to decide whether or not to negotiate. This man, Rudolf Kastner, was a Hungarian Jew who in 1944 negotiated with Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann had been sent, the Nazis had invaded Hungary, which actually had been allied with the Nazis. And Eichmann's orders were to round up and send off to be murdered Hungary's 700,000 Jews. Kastner, claiming to speak for world Jewry, and the one interesting thing about some of these Nazis is they actually believed that the Jews were extraordinarily powerful, talked about a scheme in which the Nazis were proposing that for 10,000 winterized trucks that Scouts Honor the Nazis would only use on the Eastern Front against the Russians. This is in the middle of the war. For 10,000 winterized trucks, 1 million Jews would be saved. Preposterous idea that in the middle of a war where the Allies were committed to no negotiated resolution, but unconditional surrender, that world Jewry could get together 10,000 trucks and ship them to the Nazis. But they were negotiating. And what Kastner did was persuaded Eichmann that, in fact, by the way, the Nazis permitted a couple people to be flown off to Istanbul, and they met with the Jewish Agency, and they got word both to the State Department and to London, where this scheme was, I don't think, ever taken very seriously, but it was discussed. But in the meantime, Kastner, claiming to speak for world Jewry, said, you know, they're not going to believe you're serious about this unless it's a goodwill gesture. You let some people leave. And so 1,700 were put on a train, and under some complications, they ended up getting to Switzerland. It's called Kastner's Train. Kastner, after the war, by the way, viewed himself as quite a hero. He was an incredibly courageous man. He ended up going to Israel. He was accused in the early 50s by an old guy who had come to Palestine before the war when his family had been lost. He wrote a newsletter saying Kastner was a collaborator. Kastner at the time had sort of sub-cabinet post in Ben-Gurion's government, was told, you can't take this line down, sued the old guy. The state sued him for criminal libel. Big trial in the early 50s in Israel. The trial judge writes the cruelest imaginable opinion, suggesting that somehow Kastner had sold his soul, really used the metaphor of the Faustian bargain, sold his soul to the devil. That the implicit deal, the judge claimed, was Kastner knew what was in store for hundreds of Jews that were being rounded up with lightning speed. And rather than warn them, he was busy negotiating with Eichmann to save 1,700, quote, elite. Now, actually, 1,700 were not all elite at all, but they did include some members of Kastner's family and a disproportionate number of people from Kastner's own hometown. Cruel opinion, condemning Kastner, almost written as if he were responsible for 500,000 deaths. The Israeli Supreme Court, blessedly, 2 years later, reversed it, saying that under difficult circumstances he behaved okay. In the meantime, though, Rudolf Kastner was assassinated by a right-wing Jewish extremist. So maybe one lesson is to bargain with the devil after the fact. Even if you think the outcome's been pretty good, there are going to be some people that are probably pretty unhappy with you. Indeed, our notion of a hero is usually not a negotiator. It's someone who's willing to fight to the end. And indeed, one of the interesting issues about Kastner is, and there's been some stuff recently written, there's a very interesting movie called Killing Kastner that really raises the question, why within Israel was this man never celebrated as a hero? And part of the explanation was that in terms of the image of the new, strong Israeli, it was different than the ghetto Jew who might negotiate. The Sabra was going to fight. Right? It's that kind of idea. Sad story. Another chapter is about Natan Sharansky. Sharansky was confronted with the issue of whether to negotiate with the KGB. I won't go through all the details. He served 9 years in prison, would not negotiate. Indeed, when he was finally released in an exchange where we caught a Soviet spy that we traded for Sharansky's freedom early in the Gorbachev era, when Sharansky was taken to East Berlin, he was flown there, he'd been in prison. He didn't know what was happening. And the KGB guy said to him, you see that car that's waiting to take you somewhere? When you get down, I guess it's on a game plane, whatever it is from a plane, you go down the steps, you walk in a straight line from the bottom of the car. Do not deviate. You must walk in a straight line. Sharansky said, you know, for 9 years, I refused to negotiate with you. What makes you think I'm going to do it now? He walks down the stairs and walks in a crooked fashion. Right? He wouldn't negotiate. There are a couple of business cases in the book, one of which, both of which actually, I've been involved in. This was a great software war between IBM and Fujitsu. I also have a chapter about the conflict within the San Francisco Symphony. Most people aren't aware of this, but labor management relations in the world of big city symphonies, horribly contentious. The Detroit Symphony, by the way, is now in the process of destroying itself. Chicago and Philadelphia are in jeopardy. The San Francisco Symphony, this was some years ago, had a horrific strike, and a friend who was the head of the Hewlett Foundation's program on dispute resolution asked me if I would go teach the trustees, the management, and the players how to negotiate. I said, I'm not a labor management expert, but I do like classical music. Anyway, the joke is, there's nothing like being interviewed for a job you don't think you want. And I didn't think I wanted to do this. I actually loved doing it. The chapter of the book is about my attempts to help with colleagues change an organizational culture in terms of labor management relations, where there was a vast amount of demonization going on. Last, there are 2 chapters that deal with families. A very sad story involving divorce. And then the last chapter of the book is the kind of problem we should all have. It's a fight between 3 siblings who had the good fortune to inherit a magnificent vacation home on Cape Cod. It had a waterfront, 6 acres. It had been in this family for a number of years. And the 3 children, 3 adult children, were left the house as tenants in common. They each had 1/3 acres. The father, the mother died some years earlier. The father had died, he was in his 80s, and he had a new wife. That complicated things slightly because she was only a couple of years older than the oldest of the 3 siblings. And the father, in his wisdom, had left in trust all the liquid assets of the estate for the benefit of the wife during her life, and had left the kids this magnificent house. Well, the 3 siblings, the older sister, lived in California, was a social worker. She said, now that Daddy's dead, I'm never going to go back there. I'm going to retire in a few years. I don't have much money. We should sell the house. The middle sister was married to a physician. Said, sell Swan's Way. Swan's Way is the Harding family. Mommy and Daddy wanted this not just for us, but for our children, our grandchildren. How dare you think it should be sold? To which the older sister says, we don't want to sell, that's fine. Buy me out. So the middle sister and the younger brother was the headmaster of the school. They finally decided, well, they offer to buy out the oldest sister for 1/3 of the estate tax valuation of the house. And the estate tax valuation was a lot of money, $4.5 million. So they were getting $1 million. To which the older sister's response was, 1/3 of the estate tax valuation. Sotheby's says this house is worth $6 million. The middle sister stopped speaking to her older sister, wouldn't permit her daughter to visit her over Christmas vacation. The war had begun. And I was a friend who lived next door, saw this family in the process of destroying this and asked me if I mediated. I'm not going to tell you the outcome. You have to read the book to find out. But it does have a happy ending. Indeed, my Simon & Schuster editor, the only contribution she really made to the book was to tell me that ending the book, having the last story, the divorce story, would be too depressing. I should have this story. So this is the last chapter. Before I give some advice. The advice is basically, I think, I'm a pragmatist. A very nice review said that the book is almost a pragmatist manifesto. I think you've got to compare the costs and benefits of alternative courses of action. And it's hard to do that. That's one reason I think you should get advice from others. Because of the traps that I'd be glad to go into in a little detail if we have time, I think there should be a presumption in favor of negotiation. But it's a rebuttable presumption. And then finally, I'm very suspicious of human beings think in 2 ways. We think intuitively and we think analytically. And both are perfectly valid and they interact. I mean, the more we learn about the neurosciences, the more we know they interact. But I am somewhat skeptical of people on the basis of their own moral intuitions refusing to negotiate when the impact is much broader than just on themselves. If Natan Sharansky, who, by the way, was offered a deal in which, had he repudiated his cause, he would have had a very short term, he would have been permitted to emigrate. Once he emigrated outside the Soviet Union, the KGB even winked at him and said, we know you'll say that you were coerced. Big deal. He wouldn't negotiate. He thought it was just wrong. And I admire him. I think he made a wise decision. That was a decision, though, that didn't much affect others. He was bearing the cost. One thing that troubled me a great deal is during the Bush administration, when Vice President Cheney announced that his responsibility within the administration was to make sure that our administration does not negotiate with evil regimes anywhere in the world. We fight evil. We defeat evil. I think that I much prefer a much more analytic, pragmatic assessment of whether in terms of our national interest in a particular instance, it makes sense or not. My elevator speech, I'm going to conclude with it. When you write a trade book, you have to be able from the 11th floor to the lobby, tell someone what the book's about, what the answer is. My book is about, should you bargain with the devil? My answer? Not always. But more often than you feel like it. And more often than you feel like it for two different reasons. And it's important to understand the distinction. One reason you're not going to feel like it is because of strong emotions. Anger, fear, etc. You're going to feel like either fighting or running away. Not negotiating. And these feelings can get in the way of clear thinking, of kind of trying to analyze what the costs and benefits are. But there's a second reason more often than you feel like it. And that is, if you're bargaining with if you decide to negotiate with an adversary you don't trust him, you may think it's evil, you've got to understand that if you're going to make a deal, it's going to only work if the other side also thinks they're better off. The devil's going to get something out of it. And one reason you often won't feel like negotiating is because even in circumstances where, in terms of your own interests, looking forward to the future, you really would be better off getting this conflict behind you and getting it resolved through negotiations. You're going to have to give up the pursuit of perfect justice. And you're going to have to give up the pursuit of sort of writing the moral order in terms of what this person's done in the past. And that often doesn't feel very good for very understandable reasons. Thank you very much. I'm glad to take this question.
Got questions? Raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone.
Let's get really close.
There it is.
It's always been shouty, but it's not. So I have read the book, and I've also heard Bob give this talk, or some version of it a couple of times. And I'm sure this isn't a question you're going to disagree with. It's to elaborate on something I think you and I both care about, and it's my next book, and we care about these issues, which is the role of others in all of this. Sharansky and Mandela could choose their different negotiation perspectives because of external support in different ways. And Sharansky was very brave. But it was also true. Yeah, Sharansky was very brave. But it's also true that he did know inside, that he was on something of a world movement that was looking at him. And he became a political issue between world Jewry in a way also, and the U.S. And Russia. And similarly, Mandela knew by the time he started negotiating that the apartheid cause had become a world issue. So I just wonder whether you comment on, as that is another factor that one has to consider when one bargains with the devil, and that is, you might assimilate this to alternatives and interest in but I want to say that I think that part of the context here is what are the conditions and the support that you have from others other than those in the negotiating dyad?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, what is the effect of others? And, you know, I've been long intrigued by what I call the conflicts behind the table, apart from the conflicts across the table. And I think that both Mandela especially, was extremely self-conscious of his own role as a leader. On the other hand, when he began that process, it was not with the support of the others. There was a huge amount of suspicion. And in fact, the South African government was pretty clever because gradually his imprisonment became more and more lenient. He had been offered his freedom any number of times, but on a condition that he would not accept. The condition was that he renounce the use of force and violence, and he wasn't prepared to do that. Mandela was no pacifist, and he's now been sanctified. Sharansky his cause became, he ended up personifying the cause, but it was not that way at the beginning at all. He had his wife behind it. His wife actually had left the Soviet Union. I think both of them, though, were very self-conscious about wanting to be leaders. And leadership matters. Indeed, in Churchill's case, Churchill made a lot of lousy arguments about why not to negotiate. And at one point, he said to the war captain, I found this absolutely stunning, he said, well, you know, if our great nation has to go down, what would be so bad if we went down fighting for the liberty of Western Europe? To which I sort of asked myself, who elected him? Not that it would be a noble cause, but he ended up, in my mind, coming up with a very good argument that had to do with leadership. And that was, everyone acknowledged in the War Cabinet there was a substantial risk that these negotiations would fail because Hitler would try to overreach. Although it was easy to imagine a deal that would have served Great Britain's interests, where in fact they were allowed to keep their feet. Hitler got to dominate Europe, and Hitler probably even then had as a goal to move east when he could fight the Soviets. But Churchill's argument was, our people in Britain in May of 1940 don't know how dire things are. There's going to be a huge leadership challenge. If we begin negotiating, it will not be possible to keep it secret. And if we begin negotiations and they fail, as a wartime leader, I've really been disadvantaged. It's going to be much harder for me to rally the British because Churchill understood that how central his role would be in rallying the will to persevere. But I think you're quite right. I mean, these issues of leadership and the other are very important. I think, though, that one is still left often with these decisions about what to do. And that's what I focus on.
A question? Hold it real close to you now.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier about giving Gaddafi a figurative check for $1 billion to make that situation go away.
Right.
And for him to go into quiet exile.
Right.
And this is somewhat a two-part question, but the first part is, how many lives are worth that check? And would that check alleviate the conditions to a point that would be worth signing it?
Well, you know, the hard thing about the analysis that I propose, and I want to acknowledge this, is you're always making predictions. You're trying to weigh opportunities, risks, costs, and benefits of alternative courses of action going forward. And Libya is, you know, there are no governmental institutions to speak of that he's creating. There's no civil society. So it's not as if there are going to be glory days in Libya if he left. On the other hand, what I really wanted to pose the question is the following. he's already stolen, I'm sure, much more than $1 billion. We're a rich country because of the oil. Right? And the question I'm posing is, we'd all very much like to punish him, make him pay for his deeds. But on the other hand, I don't think this is going to happen, but if he were to leave under conditions where he could go into exile and go to some country that would take him, where he could live peacefully, I think you'd probably save hundreds, maybe thousands. I think the risks in Libya right now of something akin to a civil war taking place during the next weeks, I think there'd be a lot of people dying. And to me, it would be worth $1 billion.
Another question?
So, I guess I negotiate with you now. If I thought, but I worry about whether you I want to make sure he got on the plane. He, by the way, be very worried about, am I going to really get the money? So in this kind of world where there aren't easy ways of making binding commitments, it's not an easy process.
Professor, there's a very ugly situation ongoing right now in Wisconsin with the governor and the state legislature and whether they have to roll back and eliminate collective bargaining rights for public employees.
Yes.
And it seems to be getting more and more polarized and stalemated by the hour.
Yes.
If you had your druthers and you could go in there and talk to both sides,
Yes.
what would you do?
Well, I think there could here be some kind of a negotiated deal. I'm told that well, first of all, the governor has been slightly hypocritical in that it does not entirely eliminate collective bargaining, because I think for the fire and the police, it remains. And some have noted that they apparently contributed to his campaign. On the other hand, medical benefits and retirement benefits of public employees are an enormous problem in many states. I think that apparently the leaders of some of the unions have acknowledged that they're going to have to give back a lot in terms of health care benefits and retirement benefits, which will have to get adjusted one way or another. And I think they really should get adjusted. On the other hand, I think it's wrong to eliminate the possibility of collective bargaining altogether. And I think that difficulty, which I think the press has not focused on very well, is the following. A huge problem we have in this country is in that state. There are, I bet, scores, maybe even hundreds of school districts, hundreds of municipalities, and the number of collective bargaining agreements that are going to have to get renegotiated is very, very substantial. And part of the governor's impulse here is, do we really have time in each of these localities to play some game of chicken? And a huge problem, by the way, I feel this, although this is a popular thing to do. It turns out, you know who the most active participants are in school board elections? The teachers' unions. And they usually arrange for elected school boards to be elected, not during the same time a president's being elected, but at a time when there aren't going to be a lot of people out voting. And there is a structural set of issues here in terms of how these negotiations sometimes work, where in fact the political people responsible for making the decision feel at times quite obligated because of campaign contributions. I think those things, that'll get negotiated out.
All right, we'll take one more from the very back.
First of all, thank you for a wonderful presentation tonight. My question is much more narrow. I'm a small business owner. I have a legal translation company, and people negotiate with me all the time. I'll submit a quote for $3,000 for a translation of a contract into German. The client will come back and say, "Yeah, our budget is $2,000." I said, "Well, my quote doesn't depend on your budget, but thank you very much." And I usually have the tendency to walk away because I figure, my only resource is my time. So I don't negotiate, and I see kind of metaphorical, cords
Right.
sticking out of my client's head.
Right.
But my question is now for you: should I negotiate with the devil, or should I just keep on doing what I'm doing? Which is
Well, see,
walking
what
away?
you have to worry about, this is, how, if people want to renegotiate the deal after you've provided the services.
No, before.
Oh, it's before. Well, listen, if it's before, you can choose. And what you have to think about, and what Spock would probably advise, is what are your costs? Will it still be profitable or not? Are there other benefits you might get from doing business with this particular person? Can there be repeat business of some sort? I thought you were really giving the harder case, and that is where you performed your services just fine, and then after the fact, they say, times are a lot tougher. Rather than $3,000, I'm going to pay you $2,000. And by the way, it would cost you much more than $1,000 to sue me. That's the more devilish thing. And then what you often have to think about is, will it really pay to fight or not? And in this instance, it may not. But on the other hand, might there be reputational benefits to you if you were pretty tough about it? Where, in fact, companies sometimes face this sort of issue, where a lawyer sues them claiming a defective product. It's not defective. And indeed, shortly after the complaint is filed, and there are interrogatories and depositions notice, the plaintiff's lawyer signals that, for a couple of $100,000 quickly paid, you can make this go away. And your own lawyer tells you you're going to spend more than that in the first month in terms of having to answer the interrogatory. It nonetheless may sometimes be entirely rational to refuse to negotiate, because there may be others like this strike suit lawyer who are waiting in the wings. And you've got to think, Spock would tell you, you've got to think about those sorts of things, even though in this instance it could well pay to settle.
Say quickly, could you give us your insights on Feinberg and the BP settlement incident?
I have not studied it, but I know Kenny Feinberg, and he's quite remarkable. He's an extraordinarily able guy. And what's complicated here is, in fact, he's being paid by BP. And in the 9/11 project, he was extraordinary. He did all of that pro bono and spent thousands of hours on it. And here it's not pro bono, and it's being paid by BP, and BP has the fund. And so there are now complaints rising that, he's really not neutral. I think he's trying, only because I know him personally, my bet is he's really trying to set up a fair system. I also think that there are thousands of people who were really damaged by this oil spill, maybe tens of thousands, lots of claims. And I think there's also a problem of phony claims, big problem of phony claims. And so how you in fact set up a process that can screen, that is fair, that creates an incentive for people to settle early. It's a tough job, but it'd be a very interesting thing to study. And I wish I knew more about it.
Thank Bob for again for. He's got some of his books out outside. The bookstore has some of his books out there, so if you want to find out how that story ended, you can buy a book and probably sign it. And also he's available for a few more questions afterwards. And I think we have more coffee and cookies.